Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're unpacking a truly fascinating chapter of history. When we picture the mighty Mughal Empire, our minds usually jump straight to grand palaces, famous emperors, and sweeping conquests, right? But the real secret to their immense power? It was dirt, or more accurately, the people who worked it. In this explainer, we're going to dive into how the rural agrarian society acted as the massive, tireless economic engine powering the wealth of the entire Mughal Empire during the 16th and 17th centuries. To tackle this chapter, we're going to follow a quick roadmap. First, the Mughal agrarian engine, then cultivation, irrigation, and crops. Next, inside the village community. After that, forests and tribal kingdoms. And finally, the state's master record. All right, part one, the Mughal agrarian engine. Let's get a sense of the sheer scale of this rural world. Take a second to let this number sink in. 85%. During this period, a staggering 85% of India's population lived in villages. This wasn't just some fringe society. Rural society was literally the beating heart and economic backbone of the subcontinent. Every single ounce of the empire's glittering grandeur, it was fundamentally funded by the agricultural production happening in these countless villages. So who's actually driving this massive engine? Well, to understand the labor force, we've got to look at the two main types of peasants. First up, we have the Khud Kashta. These were the locals, the residents who owned and worked their own village lands. But then you have the Pahi Kashta. These folks were non-resident cultivators who moved around working lands on a contractual basis. Now, people became Pahi Kashta for a couple of reasons. Sometimes it was by choice, chasing better tax terms down the road. Other times, it was out of brutal necessity, forced to pack up and move after a famine or serious economic distress. And this brings us to a really fascinating feature of the era, peasant mobility. This constant movement actually blew the mind of Emperor Babur, the guy who founded the Mughal Empire. In his memoirs, he specifically noted how easily these peasants could clear land and just spin up brand new settlements overnight. Think about it. If a village was dealing with a horribly oppressive tax collector, the peasants didn't necessarily have to revolt. A lot of the time, they just pack up their lives and walk away, completely leveraging the vast abundance of available land across the empire. Moving right along to part two, cultivation, irrigation, and crops. Let's look at the actual tools and outputs of the trade. Now, obviously, the summer monsoons were the absolute backbone of Indian farming, but they just weren't enough on their own. Take a look at the Persian wheel, shown in this incredible historical painting. It's this brilliant, sophisticated system of ropes, wood, and pitchers, turned by bullocks. It literally pulled water up from the wells to keep crops hydrated, even when the dry seasons hit hard. Thanks to all that abundant land, the available labor, and these clever irrigation tricks, regions were easily churning out a minimum of 2 crops a year. Just look at this breakdown. It's wild. The sheer diversity of agricultural output across the empire is just astonishing. The Mughal province of Agra was producing 39 different varieties of crops. Delhi was doing 43, and Bengal? They were growing 50 different varieties of rice alone. So here's the crucial takeaway. We really have to throw out this idea of basic medieval subsistence farming. These peasants weren't just scraping by, growing food to barely survive. They were deeply woven into a bustling commercial agriculture scene. In fact, the Mughal state heavily pushed the cultivation of cash crops, which they called jins-e-kamil, literally translating to perfect crops. We're talking about massive, sprawling fields of cotton stretching across central India and endless tracts of sugarcane in Bengal, all generating a mountain of revenue. This agrarian market was so dynamic and honestly so globally connected that it adapted to new arrivals in a flash. A great example? Tobacco. It hit the subcontinent in the early 17th century and blew up so fast as a major article of trade that Emperor Jahangir actually tried to ban it. He was genuinely worried about widespread addiction across his empire. But, as you can probably guess, his royal ban was completely useless. The agrarian market had already spoken, and tobacco was there to stay. All right, part 3, inside the village community. Let's shift our focus from the fields themselves to the people living in them. Even though the land itself was individually owned by the peasants, their whole social existence was wrapped up in a heavily managed, collective community. This community basically ran on 3 key pillars. You had the cultivators themselves, the panchayat, which was an assembly of village elders, and the village headmen, known as the Mukhadan or Mandal. Together, this trio handled everything, from settling local disputes to making absolutely sure the state got its precious tax revenue. but let's be careful not to romanticize this setup, because it definitely wasn't some perfect utopian collective. Deep, caste-based inequities strictly dictated everyday life. A huge chunk of the rural population was forced into menial tasks as agricultural laborers or major. Deeply marginalized, these folks were trapped in poverty, often literally forced to live outside the physical boundaries of the main village settlement. And what about women in this agrarian world? Well, visual evidence, like this historic painting, is super fascinating because it proves women were highly active participants in the economy. See the women there actively selling sweets in the market? Women worked shoulder to shoulder in the fields. But as we see right here, they were merchants too. We even have records from places like Punjab and Bengal showing women inheriting land and acting as powerful zamindars, managing vast agricultural estates themselves. Section 4. Forests and Tribal Kingdoms. Let's step outside the village lines. Just beyond those neatly organized, cultivated villages was a vast, wild, and totally different world. To the mighty Mughal states, the deep jungles were honestly terrifying. They saw these forests as subversive, dangerous zones. They actually called them mawas, a place of refuge where troublemakers, rebels, and runaway peasants could just disappear, using the thick brush as a perfect defense to stubbornly refuse to pay their taxes. But the empire couldn't exactly just ignore the forests either. They needed the resources locked inside them. So, despite all the friction, the Mughal army made very deliberate inroads into the jungle to extract a specific kind of tribute called peshkash. And we aren't just talking about gold or grain here. A massive, vital part of this tribute was the supply of wild elephants, which were absolutely crucial for powering the Mughal military machine. Because of all this, the borders of these forests were constantly shifting. Through literary sources like the 16th century Bengali poem Chandi Mangala, we actually see how local leaders actively handed out heavy knives and axes to peasants, telling them to go hack away at the jungle. It was a continuous, aggressive expansion, literally clearing out the wilderness to stamp down brand new, revenue-generating agricultural settlements. Finally, Section 5, the state's master record. Let's see how the big bosses kept track of it all. So most of what we've unpacked in this explainer today actually comes to us from a very specific top-down perspective. Our primary source for this chapter is the Ain-e-Akbari. It's this incredibly detailed administrative gazetteer written by Abul Faz in 1598 on the direct orders of Emperor Akbar. It is an absolute masterpiece of record-keeping, tracking crops, yields, and tax collection with mind-boggling precision. But, there's a catch. The Ain-e-Akbari presents a highly sanitized, almost perfect vision of the empire. It was basically written to prove that Akbar's rule was totally harmonious. So to get the real story, historians have to play detective. They cross-reference the Ain with distant regional records from places like Gujarat, Maharashtra, Rajasthan, and even later East India Company archives. These gritty, ground-level documents cut right through the imperial propaganda to reveal the real, everyday conflicts, the droughts, and the heavy tensions between peasants, zamindars, and the state. Let's pull back for our final overview and look at the big picture. When we check out this overarching chronology from Babur's arrival in 1526 straight through the long, powerful reigns of Akbar, Jahangir, Shah Jahan, and Aurangzeb, we can really appreciate the true foundation of this era. It was this complex, relentless agrarian engine, literally fueled by the daily sweat of millions of peasants, that sustained the empire's massive armies and its dazzling architecture through its most dominant centuries. As we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with one absolutely crucial thought to mull over. We've learned a ton about the fields, the crops, and the taxes today. But when history is primarily written from the emperor's grand desk in the capital, what vital, on-the-ground realities, the daily hopes, the fears, the raw struggles of the menial laborers and the forest dwellers might be lost to time forever? Thanks for joining me on this deep dive. Catch you on the next explainer.